Jeff, thank you for joining me. Where does today's recording find you?
Eric, thank you so much for having me. I am in Sonoya, Georgia, which is outside of Atlanta. And if you've heard of the zombie show, The Walking Dead, it's where that was filmed. We're about 10 minutes away from where the set used to be when it was still filming. So, Zombieland.
You do a lot of extra work then?
The zombies are supposed to be super skinny. So, alas, it was not a good career move for me.
Well, I suppose speaking of your career, what either do you do today or if you want to go there first, what has your journey been like that's led you to what you do today?
I make my living with the written word, and I'll probably continue to do that until Skynet takes my job, which is going to be a lot sooner, I guess, than I anticipated a few years ago based on the way things are developing. I was a history major, and so that lent itself pretty well to writing professionally. And I have worked at nonprofits and ad agencies, marketing, communications, that kind of stuff since then. And I'm not really good at anything else. So like I said, when Skynet comes, I'll, dig ditches or something.
I'm sure you have told me before that you were a history major because we've known each other for so long, but I didn't recall that. And that aside, I suppose you ended up as a copywriter, direct response copywriter, specifically working for faith-based nonprofits for the most part, right? I mean, you've been in and out of some other nonprofits.
Yeah. So, when I was younger, my career, I would say, was more well-rounded in one sense that I had the chance to do, some tourism and construction and some other businesses, even a little bit of radio and that kind of stuff. But it has definitely veered in the last 15 or 20 years that we've been friends now. But it's veered, strongly towards the nonprofit realm. And that was not something I desired or did on purpose. I wasn't against it either. That's just kind of where the opportunities came, and I was grateful for them. And, it's perhaps not as lucrative as if I was on Madison Avenue working for those sort of Fortune 500 clients, but it has been rewarding in its own right, for sure.
I think your specialty really has become writing for rescue missions, which is not a space that a lot of people are familiar with. So I don't want to misrepresent it, but I guess, can you describe who you write for?
Yeah, that's it. It's a great question because, when I got started, I had no idea what a rescue mission even was. But for the last 15 or so years, I have been writing for rescue missions. They've been a significant portion of my clientele. And essentially, a rescue mission is a homeless shelter, to put it simply. Most cities have them. A bunch of cities, big ones like New York City or Los Angeles, have multiple missions, and very often they've been around since, a long time ago. Some of them in New York, like the Bowery mission, is almost as old as the Civil War, and a lot of them predate World War I. So they've been around for a long time, but unless you were kind of heavily invested in caring for homeless people, or if you had known somebody who was homeless, you would probably not have heard of them, I would think. Like I said, I had not heard of any of them until I was assigned to start writing for them. So they were founded by a lot of Christian businessmen for the most part. Most of them are faith-based. And as you can imagine, they've evolved quite a bit over the years. Most of them continue to be Christian in nature, but they'll serve anybody without discrimination or having to pass any kind of a litmus test beyond, typically being sober and nonviolent. I'd say the clientele has changed a lot over the years, for sure. Like, even, 30 or 40 years ago when we were kids, they probably were serving a lot of Vietnam veterans, maybe like what people used to call the old hobos who had endured severe, battlefield trauma and had not been able to effectively resettle back into society, and, would walk with the stick and the handkerchief attached to it or hanging from it, across the country. And the missions were a place to kind of get a meal and a place to sleep. But in more recent times, the clientele has changed quite a bit, as they, the people who stay there, who take refuge there, are younger and really quite diverse. A lot of women, in fact. I believe women are the fastest growing group of homeless individuals in the country. And then, you know, most people are struggling with some kind of a chemical addiction at this time too.
It sounds like I know in the past you've not written exclusively for rescue missions, but it sounds like now there's at least a heavy focus there. But maybe the packaging aside, or the industry, or gosh, I don't know what term to use, that you do have a specialty or you have a lot of knowledge around homelessness and people affected by homelessness and associated challenges. Is that right?
Yeah. And, you know, like I said, it wasn't a career I sought out, but it has been a blessing in its own right, for sure. I've had the chance to travel to California and New York and Georgia and Florida and Texas and most everywhere in between, visiting clients and interviewing the people who are recovering there. And, you know, we interview the guests who are well along in their recovery for the sake of sharing their stories with donors, perhaps on social media with the community, so that people can see the good that's happening at the mission, so they can see, you know, be involved with the solution to homelessness, which is a growing problem in the country. And so it's been an awesome experience to get to know people and to hear their stories and to see what kind of factors lead to life collapse, essentially. I mean, that's what homelessness is. It's when everything falls apart. And then also what leads to restoration and renewal and how people get back on their feet.
What does the makeup of, you know, the homeless population, if I can call it that, look like? And then after that, I would like to get into what is it that takes these people there and keeps them in homelessness.
Yeah. So who's homeless? Yeah. I mean, I think in the old days, it would have been a white guy or a black guy, basically. But now, like I said, the people who are homeless now are it's very diverse. It could be anybody, and it's a lot of women too, which I don't really think that was a thing back in the day. I could be wrong. I'm not a, you know, expert historian on the history of homelessness in America, but I just know that it's a notable factor that more and more women are winding up on the streets. And of course, they face very different challenges out there. But who's homeless now? I mean, obviously, like I read recently, and you've probably seen these same studies where they show something like 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, which means if you lose your job or you have a health emergency or something, like it can be catastrophic in a hurry. So with the caveat that anyone could be homeless, nevertheless, I think there's still indicators that make it much easier to predict who will wind up homeless these days. And by and large, those could probably be summarized as trauma, addiction, or mental illness, or very often a combination of the three.
Do you think that the factors that contribute to someone ending up in homelessness are likely to be different by population? You know, like as far as you're aware, if on average a woman ends up being homeless, is that often due to a different cause from the average man?
That's a good question. I think likely she will have faced different struggles in her descent to homelessness. Obviously, sexual abuse is something that impacts women a lot more than men in general. And that's certainly a huge factor for women that wind up on the streets. But I think even digging deeper than just like something that happens to a person, I think the root of a lot of it tends to be the breakdown of the family more than anything else, and what happens when a family breaks down.
Both for men and for women?
I believe so, absolutely. And, you know, and this is an extreme example, but it's a place to start. Like in Los Angeles, you know, there's so many kids in foster care, and the experts say that within 2 years of aging out of foster care, a full 50% of those kids are going to be on the streets. I believe that's the stat. So it's heartbreaking and shocking and feels like an overwhelming problem. And obviously, if you're in foster care, like something went wrong with your family life.
Well, Jeff, you've told me before you have interviewed probably over 1,000 people who have been homeless or drug addicted or something like that at some point. And I think I remember you saying it's possible you've interviewed 2,000. So it's a large number, regardless of, you know, exactly where we pin it. It sounds to me like you hear in these stories some common occurrences or themes. So you hear that someone has some type of trauma, that probably some number of these kids, at least in, a metro area maybe, are foster kids. Maybe that's been something that they've gone through. Addiction, divorce. I don't think that I heard, except maybe that if that went along with the breakdown of the family. So I'm curious what you hear from the people you talk to, whether it's statistically representative or not.
Certainly the number one most common thing I've heard is difficult because it's such a common problem in America. But the number one thing I've heard is somebody saying, well, when I was, 8 or 10 or whatever the age might have been, my folks split up and I never got over it. And so I think more than anything else, divorce ends up being responsible for a lot of the hardships people face. I know that there are studies that have come out that have said various things about this and argued one way or another. And I also want to say, I know that there are very legitimate reasons for divorce. And if, somebody's spouse is unfaithful or abusive, I completely understand why somebody would need to leave that situation. But I think we've also all seen, to use another extreme example, like the Hollywood couple that gets together and then they're divorced 3 months later. And probably pretty much everybody knew it was coming. And you think maybe there's a middle ground here where we could take it a little bit more seriously. So it feels more serious than a weekend fling. I think that, a lot of children and families would benefit maybe from a renewed societal commitment to the sanctity of marriage, while still acknowledging that there are, bad and dysfunctional people out there who no one should have to remain married to.
My experience has been working with some of these nonprofits that it's rarely one thing that you can attribute homelessness to. It's often very common experiences that, whether they're unfortunate or sad or, just terrible or not. I'm not trying to say the quality of them or the nature, as much as often it's things that happen to all of us. But typically one thing happens and then the next thing happens and things just start to fall apart. So your parents get divorced, for example, and then I think you mentioned sexual abuse for women. You have one thing, it creates some instability, and then you deal with that. It's just making everything harder. It's harder not to drink a little bit too much, or it's harder to say no to drugs, or it's harder to work that job that you really need to pay to have your own house. And I suspect you will tell me that, yes, your perception is similar, but I'm wondering in part about, is that the character of the stories that you hear and sort of the nature of the stories that you tend to tell? It fit that mold?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And life is hard for everybody, like you said. But when you have the instability of, maybe your dad isn't around anymore, you're splitting time. So then you don't have the same level of community. You don't have the same level of parental involvement and accountability and all that kind of stuff. It's just easier. And it's just human nature to be hurt by that. And to see when you see, this isn't the right way to say it, but the regular kids who have a mom and dad and you feel different from them, to then seek to medicate those feelings. You hear about so many kids who wonder, was it my fault that my parents split up? Well, of course not. But, those kids tend to be more susceptible to falling in with the wrong crowd. And the wrong crowd tends to be, the wrong crowd because they had tough lives. They didn't just wake up one day and say, I want to do bad stuff. In as much as I feel like you can never doubt any human's capacity to make bad or self-destructive decisions. Most of the people who I've spoken with who struggled with addiction were using because they had suffered some wrong in their life. Maybe like if they were older, maybe their wife left them, or they had a child who died, or one guy recently was sharing that his dad committed suicide when he was 6 years old, and he just was never able to come to terms with it. And so at that stage, addiction becomes a coping mechanism to deal with a much deeper pain. I think that, if there's one thing I've learned from interviewing a lot of people, it's really easy to judge the addict. That guy needs to clean up and get a job. If you watch Futurama, I feel like saying that in the Professor Farnsworth voice.
Get a job.
But in reality, it's not that simple. I just don't think people wake up and say, I want to be addicted to this drug. It becomes just a way to numb the pain and forget about how they're feeling, or forget about that deep hurt that is with them every minute of the day. I'm going to take a step back here for a second. Being in advertising, when you're a young copy cub, you read the titans of the industry. And David Ogilvy is one of the greats. I know you're familiar with him, and I assume most copywriters are. And he talked about, reason why advertising being the only kind of advertising that's worth anything. You have to give the reason why behind the product, why it exists, and why you're sharing it with people. But in some ways, that addiction is I almost feel like there's a relation, like there's a reason why behind every addiction that very few people have I heard about who just, I wanted to try cocaine and then I got stuck on it. I mean, that's such a rare explanation. It's always about a hardship and something going wrong. And then, they started using as a way to mask or numb that pain. And it slowly, I should say at varying speeds, took control of their life. Some people use maybe meth once and then they're completely enslaved to it. Other people, it's alcohol where it makes them feel a little bit good on their weekend parties. And then over the years, they take more and more of it and need more and more of it. And then eventually, it usually ends up with drinking vodka as soon as you get out of bed. And so it happens at different speeds, but it's that reason why behind the addiction that I think a lot of people might not be aware of. And as much as I, support accountability and that kind of stuff, there's absolutely room for compassion to coexist alongside accountability as we, consider what people have been through that led them to this situation.
Not that long ago, I read this book called The Biology of Desire by a gentleman named Mark Lewis, who I think he has his PhD in neuroscience, and he was an addict. He's written 2 books. I forget what the other one was called, but the subtitle for his book is The Biology of Desire is Why Addiction is Not a Disease. And he argues based on, I guess, the science and his experience, and I can't remember what else. It's been a while since I read the book, that addiction is not a disease in the sense that you are simply afflicted with it, like cancer is a disease, or I don't know, Lyme disease or something of that nature, but rather that it's, I'm not going to get the term right, but basically that it's a learned behavior. And, you're not an addict because you were just afflicted with addiction. You become an addict because there's sort of this operant conditioning that you do something and you get the immediate positive response that whether you're expecting or not, you do it again and you get that positive feeling or response. And so despite the fact that there's almost always a negative side to it, if you go with just alcohol, you wake up the next morning and you have a hangover. Well, you didn't have a hangover when you had your first beer, right? And you start to serve this, you sort of start to chase the positive aspects of this, positive feelings, and do your best to ignore or mitigate the negative outcomes. And I'm curious, you've worked a lot with people in addiction that, either currently or in their past. You've heard a lot of stories. Do you have any thoughts about that claim that addiction is not a disease?
Yeah, I first of all, let me affirm what you say. For your fans who wouldn't know, you're the single most avid reader I believe I've ever met in my life. And I'm not surprised that you would read a book that is so specialized like this. I feel like there are people who know so much more about this, including some of the, rescue mission directors I've spent time with who would probably disagree. But that being said, I don't have a problem with anything you just said. My first response is kind of like, the brain is so complex that I have very little trouble believing that addiction is a disease for some people and not for others. And again, that's not something I would, bet my life on or anything. There are people who know so much more about it than I do. What I would say is that addiction is very enslaving. And whether you are a person with a strong will or a weak will, whether you are rich or poor, whether you have a lot to live for, like you have a wife and kids and a home and a vacation home and luxury cars and everything else that, the world tells us we should be working for. Or if you have nothing, if you grew up in absolute poverty and you have less now, it seems to me that addiction can ravage everybody on that spectrum just as easily and enslave them all. And so I don't know if I would, I don't know if I have a strong opinion on whether or not it's a disease, but I know that it can afflict anyone, and escaping from it is a monumental task that requires something like, a very skilled doctor to help you overcome.
As you were talking, I recalled that some of what Mark Lewis says about, the positioning of disease, and even not just positioning, but also definition of disease versus the learned behavior, or whatever his phrasing is that if you have learned this behavior, then it's easier to understand how you are responsible for it. And that's not to say, as I think you said earlier, that, there are children who are born addicted in many senses, right? And is that baby responsible? Well, for some amount of time, it's not going to be responsible, right? It will become responsible at some point, I guess. But, let's take a 45-year-old man or woman. If you're able to tell yourself that you have a disease, then it does seem to me like you might have a different understanding of your responsibility to work to alleviate that condition.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And I had not really thought about it that way. But absolutely, if you view it as a disease that just happened to you, it seems like you could be you might be more inclined to make excuses about it and to not fight it. And actually, this is kind of getting to something I thought we might talk about shortly, but it brings up, what hope is there for the addict and what leads to recovery. And I feel like the number one thing I've seen lead to recovery and foreshadow a positive outcome is accountability and taking ownership. And maybe we're not there yet. But, it's an interesting thing because humans are complex creatures, right? And you can have a ton of bad stuff happen to you and none of it's your fault, especially if you're a little kid when it started. And then at some point you start making decisions that are negative and you're older. And, there's this biblical concept of an age of accountability. And I don't quite know when that is. But at some point, like bad stuff happens to you and then you start eating from it, willingly. I don't know where it becomes your fault, but somewhere in there, like there's this accountability that takes place. And yeah, until you own that, it's going to be really hard to break free. So to the author of that book's point, absolutely. I think, as I ponder it more, I think he's making a very compelling case that viewing it like a disease can have negative consequences.
You were getting really close to talking about some of the structure, I think, that is often required of not just rescue missions, but recovery programs. And I do want to talk about that, but I've had something on my mind that I wanted to ask you about you've talked to a lot of people that deal with homelessness. Very often addiction is involved. Of course, it's not always, but very often. Mental illness must play in a large portion of these cases. And I'm not trying to say that just because people are homeless, they're crazy or that they're weak-willed or I don't know what. Sure, I mean, there are diagnoses along those lines in plenty of cases. I'm thinking more so that if you have some form of mental illness, maybe even minor, that maybe it makes it easier to make bad decisions, I don't know, does it make it easier to become addicted in the first place? I don't know, but there must be some large Venn diagram overlap between mental addiction and homelessness. Mental illness, addiction, and then people ending up homeless.
Yes, I definitely agree with you. And it's very difficult and challenging. And even though, scientists have learned so much amazing stuff about the brain and how humans operate, I feel like we're still scratching the surface of what mental illness is. And it's like a million different diseases, right? And can afflict someone a million different ways, kind of like you said, maybe just a little, or maybe so much that most people would say they need to be institutionalized. But I kind of think of it like this. If you'll allow me to draw an analogy, if the world's toughest Marine, right? Like if he can do a few deployments in a difficult place and go through battles and maybe see some things that, nobody wants to see, that we would all admit are horrible, and then come home with a bad case of PTSD, which he essentially has to deal with every single day for the rest of his life. But if the world's toughest Marine can have that, who was totally healthy when he enlisted, like what about a young lady who grew up in an abusive home and then spent 20 years on the streets, suffering through addiction and abuse and, not to be vulgar, but like probably had to sell herself to survive and get food, who suffered violence at the hands of, pimps and clients? Like, that's not an extreme case. Like that's normal for a homeless woman these days. Like what kind of mental illness is she going to have? Whatever it is, like given her disadvantages as a child, like it's going to be magnified a million times after 20 years of abuse and addiction. And so it's like you said about the Venn diagram. At that point, it's really hard to tell where the addiction stops and the mental illness starts, or where it was maybe when she first started using. I mean, there's just no way to know. And it's a heartbreaking thing. I mean, we've all seen, or if you've spent any time in a big city, we've seen people who seem just completely crazy, yelling or agitated, and there's nothing you can say to calm that person down or to have a logical or reasonable conversation with them. Like they don't have that capacity anymore. And of course, again, this is an extreme case. There's a lot of mental illness that people are able to mask or hide or treat with medication. But when you look at the more extreme examples of people who are on the streets, it's an incredibly difficult topic. And I know a lot of rescue missions and certainly professionals and, probably social workers who are employed by the state. There's all these people who want to help treat individuals in that situation. And I don't think anybody knows how.
When somebody's going through recovery, whether they relapse or not, what does it tend to look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a lot of different treatment options. Like obviously you see, $40,000 a week or a month or whatever they are options in Malibu that are, the latest of science and all that kind of stuff. And so I don't want to imply that I know all of them, but I do know the rescue mission model, which is, a comprehensive approach to addressing the root cause of a person's brokenness. So there are steps big and small. And the first step is to get their mind right, which means you have to be off all of your substances. No more drinking, no more drugs. The one thing I've seen that most of the missions allow is they allow their guests to smoke, but like no more pot, no more any other kind of chemical addiction.
So I'm going to ask this question then. Forgive me for interrupting you, just because I think that we can put it in the group of either psychoactive substances or mind altering substances or whatever, but alcohol is legal, tobacco, nicotine, it's legal, caffeine, it's legal. I think a lot of people say that caffeine is, however much stronger than heroin or whatever, right? And any reasonable adult understands that, sure, maybe it is, but the impact of caffeine on you as compared to the impact of heroin is really quite a bit different. You talked about, I think you said something about having to hit the fifth of vodka as soon as you wake up in the morning. And knowing you, I was going to make a joke about having to hit the coffee cup. But if you drink however many hundreds or thousands, I don't know, of milligrams of coffee a day, there's a very different impact on your brain and your life choices from meth or whatever the other drug is. So in these rescue mission scenarios, they do tend to allow them to smoke. Of course, there's caffeine, and they draw the line somewhere, I'm assuming. I don't know how much vaping or nicotine patches or I don't know what, Zyn gum or something there is. But I think that as you say that, the only thing that they allow them to do is this. I do think that it's well worth noting that as much as there is an addiction, right, with nicotine, for example, the long-term impact is substantially different from any of these things that would have gotten them into addiction and homelessness.
Yes, that is definitely worth talking about. And I appreciate you bringing it up because I always feel like you have the young, idealistic libertarian who wants all the drugs to be legalized and inevitably points to caffeine or wine for why all the hard drugs should be legalized. And yet the consequences of the hard drugs are just so severe. And I've heard it again and again from the people I've interviewed. You become something that you would not have believed possible. I mean, I don't care what your faith or politics are. There are just certain values we all agree are wrong. And yet, I've heard people saying I became something I hated, something I swore I never would be. I was stealing from my children, or I was stealing from my parents. I was, violent and abusive. They turn you into someone who is unreliable and who can only think about getting that next high. And drugs have certainly gotten worse over the years. And I think it was Andy Bales, in fact, who talked about meth and fentanyl being a whole new level of what they were doing to people. The old days of being the functional alcoholic, which there are some, where the functional drug user, I think, are fewer and fewer and further in between, because meth and fentanyl, which are the two dominant drugs that that the people I've interviewed seem to have been enslaved by. They make you someone that you would swear you would never be. I have not been through that kind of an addiction, so it's hard for me to describe or even understand. But as near as I can tell, every waking second of your life is just devoted to it.
Has that changed in your career? From you've been doing this for 20-ish years. Do you feel like the people that you have interviewed, that the contributing factors to homelessness or the associated factors have changed, from, I don't know what it would have been, but because we're not going to go all the way back to Vietnam vets, you probably weren't interviewing too many of those, but that nowadays you're hearing more fentanyl or whatever else and less just, a fifth of vodka a day?
Yeah, certainly. And I think part of it is that they make you feel so awful when you try to get off them. It's really it's just a wicked thing. Because, you use it and you get high, and then obviously, it's not a secret that getting high feels good to people. That's why they do it. And then when you try to not be high, or you say, all right, I'm not doing this anymore, you feel so wretchedly sick so quickly that, that I've had people describe, the worst flu you can imagine. And I remember how sick I felt when I had the flu. And of course, I'm a giant baby. So it was my wife joking with me that it was the man flu. But I was laid out. And I can't imagine having to go through that for weeks on end. I remember one guy who was well along his way to recovery, but he had been addicted to meth for a good long time, I should say. And when he first got to the mission, even after detox, he was awake for something like 2 to 3 weeks, could not sleep, was a zombie all day, basically, so exhausted and so tired. And of course, he's not just dealing with his body not being on this anymore, but with all the emotions of trying to change his life and coming to terms with the pain he had caused his family, which is enough to keep anybody awake. But then this chemical reaction in his body when his brain wasn't getting what it wanted anymore, what it had become accustomed to having, where he was, just exhausted all day. And then the second he lay down at night after finishing a long day of recovery activities, just like wide awake, just staring off. It's just brutal. That would be enough to get me to want to give up and relapse. So you see why so many people try to get over it and then just relapse. Every addict says they want to, or most of them seem like they want to get off it and want to get better. But when it comes to the rubber hitting the road of how unbelievably, unbearably sick they feel, it's understandable why they remain trapped.
You reminded me of something a little bit ago. Forgive me, another book, but you were talking about sexual abuse. And so years ago, I read this book by, I think it was Catherine Eden and Maria Kefalis, if I'm recalling their names correctly, called Promises I Can Keep, which is a really great book, and at least in my opinion. And Catherine Eden then went on to write another book with Luke Schaefer. And I think along the way, these people that I'm mentioning, I think they're all PhDs or something. And so there's a lot of research that goes on. And the book with Schaefer and Eden is called $2 a Day. And it's about living on $2 a day in the United States. And they say more than one time in the book that all of the people that they interviewed for their research, there was actually a decent number as a percentage of the people who, and they were all women, of course, who had traded sex or some form of sexual activity for money or food. And I think I recall that in a lot of cases, it was for food, not even for money, which I shouldn't even say not even for money. And I think I remember that there were a couple of cases where the men or women that they were talking to, their daughters had traded sexual activity for money or food. And yeah, anyway, I realize I'm jumping back a bit, but I remember reading this book and, talking about poverty in America and so on. And one of these girls in this book, she got, I forget what age she was, maybe in high school or something. She got a message on, I think, Instagram from her gym teacher saying, "I've been watching you for some time." And they're like, "For some time? I'm 15. How long?" I was like a little girl some time ago. And I suppose, what can we take from this? Eric reads a lot of books is one. And the second thing, I suppose, maybe more important, is just there are some people who have the odds stacked against them, whether you're born with fetal alcohol syndrome, or if you have to deal with issues of poverty or displacement or family dissolution, any number of things. They can contribute to trauma, which I think was mentioned a couple of times. And one thing after another just makes it more and more difficult, regardless of whether you're that Vietnam vet or you're the white or black man or you're a white or black woman or whatever it is. If you have something like your gym teacher approaching you and or you're not even looking for money, you're doing it just for food, to feed yourself or your siblings. Imagine that situation. And I'm going to guess that you've probably interviewed people that have told you stories like this.
I did. And in fact, it's not funny, but that you mentioned that, but literally the very first person I ever interviewed was a young lady. She was probably 18 to 20 years old, and she'd come to a rescue mission in North Carolina fairly recently. And she was the only one of her siblings who was addicted. because she had sold herself from the time she was 12 or 13 so that her younger brothers could eat. Meanwhile, her parents were both addicts. And so they were in and out of the house, and mom, to affirm the book you read, like, mom had to pay for her fix. So there was guys in and out of the house. And so this girl had grown up in a horribly abusive home before her mom just disappeared altogether. And then she had to take care of her little, like, 5, 8, and 10-year-old brothers. And the mothering instinct was so strong in her that she's like, well, I'm just going to do whatever I have to do to feed my younger brothers. It's just enough to, break your heart. What a young, like, what chance does she have in life when that's her childhood? Was just hard to fathom. But yeah, I mean, to affirm what you're saying, the sexual abuse is stunning, that the impact it has on women. And I think that there's if you'll permit me to shift slightly, there's a lot of, I think, well-meaning people, perhaps with libertarian tendencies, who feel like, well, sex work should be legal if the adults are consenting. But I think, like, maybe on paper, but in real life, like, the women who are predominantly doing that are not making that decision on paper with all of the, they're women who grew up in the worst circumstances imaginable, who are doing what they have to do to survive, who are then being completely manipulated through force of physical violence by pimps and abusive men to engage in this you should never have to sleep with somebody for food, to state something that we would all agree with. And yet, like, that's the reality, based on your book and based on people I've interviewed, that, like, that's what happens out there. And that is a fruit of the skin trade. And obviously, like, it shouldn't be that way. And yet it becomes that way very, very quickly. So I think that's, changing the subject slightly, but, like, first off, why I strongly believe that should be illegal, because it's never just on paper two consenting adults making a financial decision, or at least so infrequently that it's statistically irrelevant, but certainly because it keeps women locked into homelessness and addiction.
Jeff, what would you do if someone that you loved was dealing with, severe or long-term addiction and or homelessness or associated issues?
I love that you asked that question. And yeah, if my son was addicted to something, I would do everything I could to get him to go to one of these rescue missions. For starters, if there's anybody in this situation who's listening, like, it's free. It's all of your meals, your shelter, your counseling, your classes, your work training, so that you can, leave financially viable. I mean, you're not going to be Jeff Bezos, but you can have a job, that meets your needs. Like, all of that is provided. And so you can, comprehensively, brick by brick, rebuild your life. The elements of these missions are beautiful. They like I mentioned previously, they set out to address the root causes of a person's brokenness. And then they, try to rebuild them piece by piece physically, so that you have food and shelter, so that you can become healthy again, and emotionally to deal with the heart trauma that may have afflicted you from the time of youth or whenever things went wrong, through counseling and classes, through Bible studies for those who are spiritually inclined. I do think the spiritual element has proven very important among the people that I've interviewed, having, like, a sense of a bigger sense of purpose and redemption and forgiveness. Those are factors that touch a lot of people's hearts, since a lot of people go to the missions having not only suffered greatly, but also hurt people badly. And then having that hope of, like, I can have a life, that's different from this one. And then, financially, having a tenable future as well, having a job that's sustainable so that you can pay your bills. So the missions do all that. And so that's certainly, if somebody I loved was in that situation, I would strongly encourage them to go there and do whatever I could to get them there. I will say that there are factors that, somebody who's in that situation has to exhibit. And I'll share a story that was maybe one of my very favorite people I interviewed. He was a guy in California, and he was kind of like the first person I ever interviewed where I knew he was going to succeed just based on the accountability he modeled. I said, so tell me about yourself. And he goes, well, I was a horrible father. I was a banger. I was a horrible son. I mistreated people. I was violent. I had no self-control. I was a slave to my impulses. And he one by one took ownership of every single negative factor that you could think of. I know when I screw up or when I have a bad habit, I'm inclined to try to minimize it. Well, it's not as bad as it could have been. And I've got some progress. Just the excuses are just pathetic. But this guy, man, he just took ownership of every single thing. And sure enough, years later, when I went back to that mission for another trip, he was doing great. He was working there. He was ministering to people. So seeing somebody who's hit that rock bottom and who can acknowledge and not make excuses anymore is really critical. And in no way, shape, or form did that guy deny that bad things had happened to him, but he took ownership of the things that he was responsible for. And I feel like until that happens, it's really hard to recover, because to go back to your point previously, we feel like it's a disease or like it's a victim. We have a victim mentality, and we can be victims and yet still take ownership. Those two don't have to live in contradiction with each other. They can exist in tension with each other, and yet a person can accept both and move forward. I think that's what the missions do really well.
There's a lot that I want to ask you about, especially around, you talked about some of the spiritual or religious aspects, because I definitely have an opinion on whether any of these belief systems are right or wrong. That simplifying things for people, giving them something to rely on, I think really matters. There are things to dig into there. The community, having a community, because if you've gone through addiction or homelessness, you probably haven't had that. There are lots of things, but I do know that we also have a limited time today, unfortunately. We talked a lot before we hit record because we needed some time to catch up. So I'll wrap up with, I think, 2 questions, unless something else comes up. One is, where should people go to connect with you or to learn more? Where would you direct them, whether it's you or somewhere else? And 2, do you have any words of wisdom or things that you would want people to know before we're done?
Yeah, I appreciate that. People can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Jeff Meredith, and I think I'm listed as an associate creative director at RKD Group, which is my day job. And so they can find me there. Heck, I'm on Facebook too, so any of the socials. But yeah, I guess if there's something I wanted people to know, if you'll permit a spiritual proselytizing, I won't make it long or awkward. But I'll say that, what I've seen give the mission guests hope in going back to that, or just any of the people who've experienced homelessness and addiction and abuse and all these awful things, and who have then in turn done bad things. Like, everybody wants to make sense of the story. Like, why did I go through this? If there's a real God, why did he let me go through? That's a question that I've heard again and again that they were asking themselves while they were on the streets. And, people have cried out to God from rock bottom and then had faith journeys from there. I'd say we can't know. Like, you just can't know all that stuff. Like, if there is a transcendent God of the universe, you're not, being a human, you're not going to know all the reasons why he did the things he did or allowed the things he allowed. But I think the power of the missions, the faith-based missions at least, is that the guests experience forgiveness. Like, when they see all the bad they've done, they see a guy on a cross with his arms stretched out who calls without condemnation, in spite of knowing everything really well, like the wrong that people do. And so I think that's very comforting, as you can imagine, to somebody who's lived through the worst of life and maybe done some things that they sincerely regret. Of course, you don't have to, heck, you can be like me. You can have done tons of things you regret without being homeless or addicted, So anyhow, I guess I would share that message. I think that gives the missions a lot of their impact in people's lives. And if you'll forgive me for taking it in a more spiritual nature, I appreciate the opportunity.
Jeff, I appreciate you recording with me. I'm glad that the weather in your area cooperated, and I'll have links to everything we talked about in the show notes. So thank you for being here, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Eric, thank you so much sincerely for the privilege of chatting with you about this cause that has become near and dear to my heart. I sincerely appreciate it.